Good morning, students. Welcome to the IGCSE online sessions. I'm Mr. Charles, and this is the third lesson of week 7. Please go to your coursebook, page 182, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. Let's read together. Showing and Telling. The first book in J.R.R. Tolkien's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, is The Fellowship of the Ring. The novel begins at a party for the famous hobbit, Bilbo Baggins' 111th birthday. Bilbo reluctantly gives his heir, Frodo Baggins, a ring with strange and dangerous properties. It is the One Ring of Legend. Frodo is told that the ring must be taken away from the Shire, where the hobbits live, because it holds an evil power. Frodo is warned that he must never put it on. Frodo leaves the safety of the Shire with his small hobbit friends, Sam, Merry, and Pippin, but he is soon pursued by the 9 Ringwraiths, who take the form of terrifying black riders. This is the poster of the movie that is 3-parters, and it is a movie adaptation of a book or a 3-parted book by J.R.R. Tolkien, who is an English poet who lived, I think, up until 1970s. He died in the 1970s with several books left behind that later were were made into movies. One of which is The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit as well. Frodo hesitated for a second. Curiosity or some other feeling was struggling with his desire to hide. The sound of hoofs drew nearer. Just in time, he threw himself down in a patch of long grass behind a tree that overshadowed the road. Then he lifted his head and peered cautiously above one of the great roots. Round the corner came a black horse. No hobbit pony, but a full-sized horse. And on it sat a large man, who seemed to crouch in the saddle, wrapped in a great black cloak and hood, so that only his boots in the high stirrups showed below. His face was shadowed and invisible. When it reached the tree and was level with Frodo, the horse stopped. The riding figure sat quite still, with its head bowed, as if listening. From inside the hood came a noise as of someone sniffing to catch an elusive scent. The head turned from side to side of the road. A sudden unreasoning fear of discovery laid hold of Frodo, and he thought of his ring. He hardly dared to breathe, and yet the desire to get it out of his pocket became so strong that he began slowly to move his hand. He felt that he had only to slip it on, and then he would be safe. "Hush," said Frodo. "I think I hear hoofs again." They stopped suddenly and stood as silent as 3 shadows, listening. There was a sound of hoofs in the lane, some way behind, but coming slow and clear from the wind. Quickly and quietly, they slipped off the path and ran into the deeper shade under the oak trees. "Don't let us go too far," said Frodo. "I don't want to be seen, but I want to see if it is another Black Rider." "Very well," said Pippin, "but don't forget the sniffing." The hoofs drew nearer. They had no time to find any hiding place better than the general darkness of the trees. Sam and Pippin crouched behind a large tree bole, while Frodo crept back a few yards towards the lane. It showed grey and pale, a line of fading light through the wood. Above it, the stars were thick in the dim sky, but there was no moon. The sound of hoofs stopped. As Frodo watched, he saw something dark pass across the lighter space between two trees, and then halt. It looked like the black shade of a horse led by a smaller shadow. The black shadow stood close to the point where they had left the path, and it swayed from side to side. Frodo thought he heard the sound of sniffing or snuffling. The shadow bent to the ground and then began to crawl towards him. Writer's Craft, page 182, is Tolkien's showing the reader what is happening or telling, or both. Give examples that justify your opinion. Well, what is the difference between showing and telling? The difference between to show and to tell a story is that when the writer show the story, they leave room for readers' imaginations to draw conclusions and images from the characters and situations. But when the writer tells a story, they describe vividly, precisely characters and situations, leaving little room or no room at all for readers' completion of the elements. And in the first extract, the writer is showing, and this is because he writes, on it sat a man who seemed to crouch in the saddle. The riding figure sat quite still, with its head bowed as if listening. And seemed and as if are suggestive words or phrases. They allow us readers to decide. And this is done because of the fact that Sam, Pippin, and all of the other hobbits, all of the four hobbits, were hiding. They can only guess what other characters in the scene are doing. Imagine that you and I are in a house, and you are in the kitchen, let's say, and I am in the living room, and I hear sounds from the living room or sounds from the kitchen where you are, and I can only guess what you are doing in the kitchen based on the sounds, but I cannot be sure. So if I describe in a piece of writing what you are doing in the kitchen, it's gonna be showing, not telling. It's gonna be suggestive. The sounds, let's say, Ahmad is making are of or seem to be that he's cooking, let's say, dolma, or they sound to be as if he is cleaning the floors. This is not 100% true. I'm leaving room for you readers to decide whether this is happening or not, because I'm not third person POV. I'm not omniscient writer. I cannot know everything of what's going on everywhere at all moments. I'm only in the first person or second person point of view. That's why it is limited to me to know. And this is, some people argue that it's a little better than to tell the story because you still leave room for readers to interpret the way their backgrounds and their fantasies of the story require. To write a narrative, the question on page 183 says rewrite this excerpt from The Lord of the Rings in the first person. You can be Frodo, Pippin, or Sam. Try to create a sense of fear or menace. This is partially opinionated. I want you to take approximately 20 minutes or to 25 minutes to write not 350 words, write only 200 or 250 for you to describe or for you to narrate what happened. But before you go, the points that you have to include or it is better to include. First, know that you must change all the pronouns from the second or third person written to the first person because we have a lot of they and them and their in the text. This has to change to I, me, we, us, etc. The possessive or the object subject pronouns, they denote first person. The second point to remember is that you should stick to the same sequence of the story. You no need to change the events or their occurring sequence. Start with hearing the hooves and end with the shadowing closing on you as, let's say, Frodo. Third point to remember, that is to include all the points in the question, is that you should maintain the feelings of terror and danger. The question says try to create a sense of fear or menace. If you noticed in the story, the setting of the story, that is a wood with a lot of creatures that could be there. They are little people, they are dwarfs. They cannot really feel safe because of their size or height. The leaves of the trees make shadows since it is night, and they don't provide clear vision. The night it was a moonless night. It had no moon, so there was not even good lighting in the scene, and the stillness and the quietness as well, and their anticipation of a black horse and a black rider on top of it. And then the writer did not introduce the rider itself as an image or in person. It introduced its shadow to increase fear. Imagine that you are sitting in your living room and then you see a shadow. This makes you a lot more afraid than if you see a real person. Because if you see a real person, you know who that is. You know what to do. You know if this is related to you or not. You know what weapon to use with that person. But if you see a shadow, this is open interpretation to any creature or human, or depending on your background knowledge and, as we said, fantasies. But the shadow is another point to include in your writing to increase danger. The device that is called in medias res, Greek device, that is, or Greek calling of the device, is that you should start in the middle of the story. No need to introduce the characters, just like the passages, the excerpts in the book. You don't need to tell us who is Frodo, or as you, who are you, and who is Pippin if you want to be Pippin, and what are you doing here, and where are you going. No need. Start in the middle. Starting in the middle of the story is a device called in medias res. For example, the points to turn from this story into first person, you could say, I heard an eerie sound of hooves. Before, I could have seen the Black Rider. We stood in silence, waiting. We quickly ran to the shadows of an oak tree to see if it was the Black Rider. The Black Rider approached us quickly, so there was no time to move to another hiding spot. All of these points, if you notice, they include words or phrases that increase danger, that increase fear. I saw darkness pass through the dim light between the trees and then stop. All of these examples are to include or try to include similar to them in your piece of narrative. Well done for today. Thank you very much for listening. Stay safe and keep up the good work.